Sometimes the greatest treasures in life come disguised as the very burdens we try to avoid. For Samuel Cross, a wealthy but lonely cattle baron in 1882 Colorado Territory, that truth would arrive in the form of 3 ragged little girls who refused to leave his side. Samuel had spent 53 years building walls around his heart, convinced that solitude meant strength and that needing nobody made him powerful. His vast ranch stretched across 3 counties, his cattle numbered in the thousands, yet his dinner table sat only 1. He told himself this was exactly how he wanted it. Then, one autumn morning, 3 small figures appeared at his gate. The girls looked no older than 6, 8, and 10, with threadbare dresses and shoes that had seen better decades. They didn't speak or beg or even come close. They just followed him everywhere he went, always keeping their distance, always watching with those desperate, knowing eyes. What secret were these children carrying that would change everything Samuel believed about family and the true meaning of wealth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gold pocket watch ticked against Samuel Cross's vest with the precise rhythm that had governed his life for 30 years. 5:30 in the morning, every morning, without fail. He'd inherited the timepiece from his father, along with everything else, the ranch, the cattle, and the cold certainty that depending on others led only to disappointment. Samuel's boots echoed against the hardwood floors of his sprawling ranch house as he made his way to the kitchen. The silence didn't bother him anymore. It had become his closest companion, more reliable than any human he'd ever known. He prepared his coffee with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. 2 scoops of grounds, boiling water, exactly 4 minutes to steep. No sugar, no cream. Comfort was for the weak. Outside, the Colorado Territory landscape stretched endlessly under the pale morning sky. His property began at the creek that wound through Millbrook and extended beyond the foothills, encompassing more land than most men could dream of owning. The Cross Ranch employed 27 hands during peak season, managed over 3,000 head of cattle, and generated more revenue than the next 5 largest ranches combined. Samuel had built this empire through careful calculation, ruthless negotiation, and an unwavering refusal to let sentiment cloud his judgment. He stepped onto his front porch, coffee in hand, and surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a man who had conquered everything he'd set out to conquer. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke from the town. Soon, the first snows would arrive, and he'd move the herds to the protected valleys. Everything ran according to his schedule, his vision, his will. That's when he saw them. 3 small figures stood at the edge of his property, maybe 50 yards from the main gate. Children by their size, though from this distance he couldn't make out their faces. They stood perfectly still, like deer that had wandered too close to civilization and weren't sure whether to flee or approach. Samuel frowned and checked his watch. 5:45. His foreman, Dutch Williams, wouldn't arrive for another hour. The children, for that's surely what they were, shouldn't be on his property at this hour, or any hour, for that matter. He set down his coffee and walked toward them, his footsteps deliberate and measured. As he drew closer, details emerged that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. 3 girls, the oldest no more than 10, wearing dresses that might have been colorful once, but had faded to the gray-brown of road dust and neglect. Their hair hung in tangles, their feet were wrapped in cloth and rope that barely passed for shoes, and their faces carried the hollow-eyed look of children who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "You're on private property," Samuel called out when he was 20 yards away. "This is the Cross Ranch. You need to move along." The girls didn't respond. They didn't run, either. They simply watched him with those enormous dark eyes, as if they were studying him, measuring him against some invisible standard. The oldest stepped slightly in front of her sister, a protective gesture that reminded Samuel of something he didn't want to remember. "Did you hear me?" He tried again, this time in the rudimentary Spanish he'd picked up from years of dealing with vaqueros and traders. Este es propiedad privada. The smallest girl whispered something to her sisters in rapid Spanish, too quick and quiet for Samuel to catch. The oldest nodded and took a single step backward, but they didn't leave. They simply maintained their distance, watching and waiting. Samuel felt his jaw clench. He had neither the time nor the patience for whatever game this was. He had cattle to move, accounts to review, and a meeting with the Territorial Land Commissioner that afternoon. He turned and walked back toward the house, expecting to hear the sound of small feet scurrying away. Instead, when he reached his porch and glanced back, they were still there, still watching. By 7 o'clock, when Dutch arrived with the first crew of ranch hands, the girls had moved. They now stood near the water trough by the main corral, close enough to observe the morning's activities, but far enough away to avoid direct confrontation. Dutch, a weathered man with more common sense than formal education, noticed them immediately. "Boss, you got some visitors," he said, nodding toward the girls. "I noticed. Any idea where they came from?" Dutch shook his head. "Been traveling, looks like. Been traveling hard. You want me to run them off?" Samuel considered this. The easiest solution would be to have Dutch escort them to the main road and let them become someone else's problem. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way the oldest girl kept her sisters close, or the fact that they'd managed to find his property despite its isolation. Most likely, it was simply his curiosity about what 3 children were doing alone in the Colorado wilderness with winter approaching. "Leave them be for now," he said, "but keep an eye on them. If they cause any trouble or get in the way of the work, then we'll deal with it." The morning proceeded according to Samuel's usual schedule. He reviewed the previous day's numbers with his bookkeeper, discussed winter preparations with Dutch, and spent 2 hours riding the fence line to check for damage. Throughout it all, the girls maintained their vigil. They moved when he moved, always keeping that careful distance, always watching. By midday, Samuel's irritation had grown into something approaching fascination. He'd dealt with beggars before, children and adults alike, who came to his property looking for handouts or work. They always approached directly, hat in hand, with practiced pleas and sob stories. These girls were different. They asked for nothing, said nothing, demanded nothing. They simply existed in his peripheral vision like a persistent ache. During lunch, which he ate alone at his dining room table, as always, Samuel found himself glancing out the window to check on them. They'd found shade under a cottonwood tree near the creek, close enough to observe the house but positioned so they could disappear quickly if needed. The middle girl was braiding the youngest one's hair, while the oldest kept watch. It was such a normal, sisterly scene that it made Samuel's throat tight. He pushed the feeling away and returned to his meal. Sentiment was a luxury he'd given up long ago, along with trust, hope, and all the other emotions that made men weak and foolish. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, and he'd built his life around making sure he never had to learn it again. But as the afternoon wore on and the girls maintained their silent presence, Samuel found his thoughts drifting to places he'd locked away years ago. Memories of another child with dark hair and serious eyes. Another protective instinct he'd failed to honor. Another chance at family he'd destroyed with his pride and anger. The Territorial Land Commissioner arrived at 3 o'clock, and their meeting lasted until nearly sunset. When Samuel finally walked the man to his carriage, he half expected the girls to be gone, vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared. Instead, they were closer than ever, standing just outside the circle of light cast by the lanterns Dutch had lit around the main corral. "Persistent little things, aren't they?" the commissioner observed, following Samuel's gaze. "They'll move on," Samuel replied, though he was no longer certain he believed it. After the commissioner left, Samuel stood on his porch and studied the 3 small figures in the gathering darkness. The temperature was dropping quickly. Autumn nights in the Colorado Territory could be brutal, especially for children with no proper shelter. The decent thing would be to offer them a place in the barn for the night, maybe some food and warm blankets. But decency, like sentiment, was a luxury Samuel had abandoned. These children weren't his responsibility. He owed them nothing, and they'd made no claims on his charity. If they chose to spend the night outdoors, that was their decision to make. He went inside, locked the door, and tried to put them out of his mind. But as he sat in his study reviewing ledgers by lamplight, Samuel found himself listening for sounds from outside, footsteps on the porch, voices calling for help, anything that might require his attention. The silence felt different tonight, heavier somehow, weighted with possibilities he didn't want to consider. When he finally went to bed, Samuel Cross told himself he'd done the right thing. He'd maintained his boundaries, protected his solitude, refused to be drawn into whatever drama these children represented. Tomorrow, they'd be gone, and his life would return to its comfortable, predictable rhythm. But deep in his heart, in the place where he kept the memories he tried so hard to forget, Samuel knew that some things, once seen, could never be unseen. And 3 pairs of dark, knowing eyes had seen straight through the walls he'd spent 30 years building, down to the frightened, guilty man he'd hidden inside. The storm arrived 3 days later with the fury that only Colorado territory could deliver. Samuel woke to the sound of wind howling around the house and rain hammering against the windows like tiny fists demanding entry. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating his bedroom in stark black and white, and thunder followed close behind, with crashes that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ranch. His first thought was of the cattle. His second was of the 3 girls. They'd maintained their vigil for 2 full days, moving like shadows around the periphery of his property. Sometimes they disappeared for hours, presumably to find food or water, but they always returned to their silent watch. Samuel had grown accustomed to checking for them whenever he stepped outside, though he told himself it was merely to ensure they weren't interfering with ranch operations. Now, as rain pounded the earth and lightning carved violent paths across the sky, he couldn't help but wonder where 3 small children might find shelter on a night like this. Samuel dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it was intensifying. Through the window, he could see nothing but sheets of rain, illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. The smart thing would be to stay inside until dawn, let the storm pass, and deal with whatever damage it caused in the morning. But something pulled him toward the front door. Maybe it was the memory of another storm, 20 years past, when his prideful stubbornness had cost him more than he'd ever imagined possible. Maybe it was simple human decency, finally overriding his carefully constructed indifference. Or maybe it was just the nagging certainty that some things were more important than staying warm and dry. He pulled on his rain slicker and stepped onto the porch. The wind immediately tried to tear the door from his hands, and rain stung his face like thrown gravel. The lantern he carried barely penetrated the darkness, its light swallowed by the storm's fury. "Hello," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Anyone out there?" Nothing but the storm's roar answered him. Samuel made his way toward the barn, fighting against gusts that threatened to knock him off his feet. If the girls had sought shelter anywhere on his property, it would be there. The barn was solid, weatherproof, and far enough from the house to maintain the distance they seemed to prefer. The heavy barn doors groaned as he pulled them open, his lantern casting dancing shadows across the interior. At first, he saw nothing unusual: hay bales stacked to the rafters, tools hanging in their designated places, the familiar scents of leather and animal feed. Then the light caught something that made him freeze. Huddled in the far corner, pressed against the wall like trapped animals, were the 3 girls. They were soaked through, their thin dresses clinging to small frames that shook with cold and fear. The oldest held her sisters close, her dark eyes wide and defiant in the lantern light, as if she expected him to drive them back out into the storm. For a moment, Samuel couldn't speak. They looked so small, so vulnerable. Yet there was something fierce in the way the oldest girl positioned herself between him and her sisters. It reminded him painfully of another child who had once tried to protect those she loved, another moment when his pride had blinded him to what really mattered. "Dios mío," he breathed, then caught himself. I mean, how long have you been out here?" The girls didn't answer, but their silence spoke volumes. They'd been in the storm, possibly for hours, and had only sought shelter when they had no choice. Even now, they looked ready to bolt if he made any threatening moves. Samuel set his lantern on a barrel and held up his hands to show he meant no harm. "It's all right," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "You can stay here. The storm, it's not safe outside." The oldest girl whispered something to her sisters in rapid Spanish. Samuel caught only fragments, but her tone was cautious, uncertain. They were afraid not just of the storm, but of him. They'd been watching him for days, but they still saw him as a potential threat. As Samuel studied them in the flickering light, details emerged that made his chest tighten. These weren't just poor children, they were desperate ones. Their clothes were not merely old, but carefully mended, patched and repatched by loving hands that had done their best with very little. Their faces bore the hollow look of hunger, but more than that, they carried the weight of recent grief. He'd seen that expression before, in his own mirror, after losing someone who mattered more than life itself. "You're hungry," he said, though it wasn't really a question. The middle girl's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and she pressed her hands against it in embarrassment. The oldest shot her a warning look, but the damage was done. These children were starving. Samuel made a decision that surprised him. "Wait here," he said. "I'll bring you something to eat." He left the lantern with them and fought his way back through the storm to the house. In his kitchen, he gathered what supplies he could quickly assemble: bread, cheese, dried meat, a jar of preserves Martha Henderson had brought him from town. He wrapped everything in a tablecloth and added a pot of leftover coffee and 3 tin cups. When he returned to the barn, the girls hadn't moved. They watched him warily as he set the food on a hay bale and stepped back to give them space. After a moment's hesitation, the oldest approached the bundle. She unwrapped it carefully, as if she expected it to disappear, then whispered urgently to her sisters. They fell on the food with the controlled desperation of children who had learned to eat quickly before someone could take their meal away. Samuel found himself looking away, uncomfortable with their gratitude and his own delayed response to their obvious need. That's when the oldest girl reached into a small bundle Samuel hadn't noticed before, a tattered cloth bag that seemed to contain their only possessions. She withdrew something that made Samuel's blood freeze in his veins. It was a photograph, torn along one edge and water-stained, but still recognizable. The image showed a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes, standing beside a man Samuel didn't recognize. But the woman's face, Samuel would have known those features anywhere, even after 20 years. "Where did you get that?" The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and the girls shrank back in fear. Samuel forced himself to take a deep breath. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you. But that photograph, the woman in it, where did you get it?" The oldest girl clutched the photograph to her chest and whispered something that sounded like a name. Samuel caught only part of it, but it was enough to send his world spinning. "Maria," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Maria Cross." The girl nodded eagerly and launched into rapid Spanish, holding up the photograph and pointing at the woman's face. Samuel's limited vocabulary couldn't follow her words, but her meaning was clear enough. This photograph connected them to Maria's sister Mary, who had died 20 years ago in a fire that Samuel had caused through his own stubborn pride. His sister, whom he'd abandoned in her hour of greatest need. His sister, who had forgiven him with her dying breath while he was too proud and angry to be there to hear it. Now 3 orphaned children were carrying her photograph, seeking him out with a desperation that suggested their very lives depended on finding him. But Mary was dead, had been dead for 2 decades. How could these children possibly be connected to her? As if reading his confusion, the oldest girl reached into her bag again and withdrew something else. This time it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. She held it out to him with trembling fingers. Samuel took the paper and unfolded it carefully. The writing was in Spanish, written in a woman's careful hand. He could make out a few words. Hermano meant brother, Niñas meant girls. Ayuda meant help, but the full meaning escaped him. "I can't read this," he said, showing the girls the letter, "but I know someone who can." The storm raged on outside, but inside the barn, surrounded by hay and the scent of animals, Samuel Cross faced the possibility that his past had finally caught up with him. 3 small girls, carrying his dead sister's photograph and a letter written in Spanish, had traveled hundreds of miles to find him. They'd endured hunger, cold, and fear to reach his isolated ranch, guided by some connection to Mary that he couldn't begin to understand. As he looked at their exhausted faces in the lantern light, Samuel realized that his carefully ordered world was about to change forever. These children weren't just seeking shelter from the storm, they were seeking him, specifically him, for reasons that might force him to confront the guilt and regret he'd buried along with his sister 20 years ago. The rain continued to pound against the barn roof, but inside, 3 little girls had finally stopped running. And Samuel Cross, for the first time in 2 decades, was about to learn what it meant to be needed by someone other than himself. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the ground like scattered diamonds. Samuel found himself in the unfamiliar position of worrying about someone other than his cattle and his ledgers. He'd left the girls in the barn with extra blankets and had spent a restless night wondering what he'd gotten himself into. When he approached the barn just after sunrise, he could hear voices soft, musical Spanish, punctuated by occasional giggles. The sound stopped him in his tracks. When was the last time he'd heard children's laughter on his property? When was the last time he'd heard laughter at all? He knocked gently on the barn door before entering, a courtesy that felt strange but necessary. The girls had arranged themselves around a small pile of possessions, and Samuel could see they'd been taking inventory of their meager belongings. The oldest looked up at him with cautious hope, while her sisters remained close to her side. "Buenos dias," Samuel attempted, earning a small smile from the youngest girl. "Buenos dias, señor," the oldest replied, then struggled with English words. "We thank you. For food, for," she gestured around the barn. Samuel nodded, studying each girl more carefully in the morning light. The oldest was indeed around 10, with long, dark hair that had been carefully braided despite their circumstances. Her face held a seriousness beyond her years, the look of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. The middle girl appeared to be 7 or 8, with softer features and eyes that still held traces of childhood wonder despite their recent hardships. The youngest couldn't be more than 5, with chubby cheeks that spoke of better times and a thumb that found its way to her mouth when she was nervous. "What are your names?" Samuel asked slowly, pointing to each girl in turn. The oldest straightened her shoulders. "Rosa," she said, then indicated her sisters. "Elena, Carmen." "Rosa, Elena, Carmen," Samuel repeated, committing the names to memory. "I'm Samuel Cross." Rosa's eyes widened at the surname, and she whispered urgently to her sisters. Carmen tugged at Rosa's dress and whispered something that made Rosa nod and reach for her precious bundle of possessions. This time, Rosa pulled out something Samuel hadn't seen the night before, a small wooden music box, its paint worn away by countless handlings. She wound the tiny key and set it on a hay bale between them. The melody that emerged was hauntingly familiar, a simple lullaby that sent chills down Samuel's spine. He knew that song. Mary used to hum it while she worked in their mother's garden, her voice clear and sweet in the afternoon sunlight. She'd sung it to comfort him during thunderstorms when they were children, her small hand holding his while lightning illuminated their shared bedroom. "Where did you get this?" Samuel's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Rosa began speaking in rapid Spanish, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to explain. Samuel caught fragments: Mama, Musica, Maria, but the full story eluded him. Whatever connection these children had to his sister, it went deeper than a simple photograph. Eleanor, perhaps sensing his frustration with the language barrier, surprised him by speaking in careful, accented English. "Mama, sing this. Always sing this," she say. She say Maria teacher. Samuel felt his chest tighten. Your mama knew Maria? Elena nodded vigorously. Mama say Maria is. She struggled for the word, then reverted to Spanish. Hermana del corazón. Sister of the heart, Samuel translated slowly. His limited Spanish was enough for that. The pieces began to form a picture, though many gaps remained. These girls' mother had known Mary, had learned her lullaby, had somehow acquired her photograph and music box. But Mary had been dead for 20 years. Could their mother have known her? Rosa reached into her bundle again and produced a larger photograph, this one showing a woman with the 3 girls. The woman bore a resemblance to the girls, but not to Mary. She was beautiful in a quiet way, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, but she was definitely not Samuel's sister. Mama, Elena said sadly, pointing to the woman in the photograph. Where is she now? Samuel asked, gently. Rosa's face crumpled, and she whispered something that sounded like, Cielo heaven. Carmen began to cry, and Elena wrapped her arms around her little sister. The grief in the barn was palpable, fresh and raw. Samuel found himself moving closer, his usual distance forgotten in the face of their pain. I'm sorry, he said. I'm very sorry. They were orphans then, 3 little girls who had lost their mother and somehow found their way to his ranch carrying pieces of his sister's memory. The responsibility of what that might mean settled on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Are you hungry? He asked, and was rewarded with cautious nods. For the first time in 30 years, Samuel Cross found himself cooking breakfast for more than one person. He brought supplies to the barn rather than inviting the girls into his house that felt like too big a step for all of them. Instead, he set up a small camp stove and showed them how to prepare eggs and bacon while coffee percolated in a tin pot. Rosa proved to be a capable helper, translating his instructions for her sisters and handling the hot pan with the competence of a child who had cooked many meals. Elena chatted quietly in Spanish, asking questions that Rosa answered with the patience of someone accustomed to teaching. Carmen mostly watched with wide eyes, though she clapped her hands when Samuel flipped an egg without breaking the yolk. As they ate, Samuel found himself studying their mannerisms, their interactions, the way they cared for each other. Rosa was clearly the protector, making sure her sisters had enough food before taking her own portion. Elena was the communicator, the bridge between Spanish and English, between fear and trust. Carmen was the heart, the one whose smiles could lighten the mood, despite their circumstances. How long have you been traveling? Samuel asked. Rosa held up fingers, first 5, then 5 again, then added 2 more, 12 days. They'd been on the road for 12 days, 3 small girls with nothing but what they could carry, making their way across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. From where? Nuevo Mexico, Rosa said. Santa Fe. Santa Fe. That's where Mary had gone after the fire, after Samuel's pride and anger had driven her away. She'd written him letters for years, letters he'd been too stubborn to answer, too ashamed to acknowledge. Eventually, the letters had stopped coming, and Samuel had told himself he was glad to be rid of the painful reminders. But Mary had built a life in Santa Fe. She'd found people who cared about her, who learned her songs and kept her photographs. Somehow, through connections, Samuel couldn't yet understand that life had led to 3 orphaned girls seeking him out 20 years later. After breakfast, Samuel made a decision that surprised him. Would you like to learn some English? He asked. I could teach you. Rosa's face lit up with hope. Sí, por favor. They spent the morning with basic lessons. Samuel pointed to objects around the barn and spoke their English names, while the girls repeated them in their musical voices. Hey, bucket, rope, saddle. Rosa was quick to catch on. Elena was eager to try, and Carmen mostly giggled and pointed at everything with delight. But it was when Samuel taught them the English words for family relationships that the real breakthrough came. Brother, he said, pointing to himself. Sister, and he pointed to the photograph of Mary. Rosa's eyes widened with understanding. "Brother," she said excitedly. "You, Maria's brother." Samuel nodded, and for the first time since they'd arrived, he saw hope bloom in all three faces. They hadn't just been seeking shelter or charity, they'd been looking for family. Somehow, in their child's understanding of the world, they'd believed that Mary's brother would help them, would care for them, would give them what they'd lost. The weight of that expectation should have terrified him. For 30 years, Samuel had avoided emotional entanglements, refused to let anyone depend on him, built his life around the certainty that he was better off alone. But looking at three pairs of dark eyes, filled with trust and hope, he found that his carefully constructed walls were already beginning to crack. As the day wore on and the girls grew more comfortable in his presence, Samuel began to see glimpses of who they'd been before tragedy struck their lives. Rosa had a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor that reminded him painfully of Mary. Eleanor had an artist's eye, arranging their few possessions with an aesthetic sense that spoke of a gentle soul. Carmen had a laugh that could fill empty spaces, a natural joy that had somehow survived their recent losses. That evening, as Samuel prepared to return to his house, Rosa approached him with the Spanish letter they'd shown him the night before. "Please," she said in careful English. "You read? Tomorrow?" Samuel took the letter, feeling its weight in his hands. Whatever it contained might answer the questions that had been building all day. It might explain how 3 children from Santa Fe had come to carry pieces of his sister's life, might reveal what they needed from him, might change everything he thought he knew about his past. "Tomorrow," he promised. "I'll find someone to read it tomorrow." As he walked back to his house through the gathering darkness, Samuel found himself listening to the sounds coming from the barn, quiet voices, occasional laughter, the music box playing its haunting melody. For the first time in decades, his property didn't feel empty. That night, he lay awake thinking about responsibility, about the difference between choosing solitude and having it forced upon you, about 3 little girls who had traveled across a territory to find someone they'd never met but somehow trusted to save them. The music box melody echoed in his memory, and with it came the sound of Mary's voice from long ago, singing the same lullaby while she tucked him into bed. "Family isn't just about blood, Samuel," she told him once. "It's about who you'd cross the world to help, and who would cross the world to help you." 3 children had crossed their world to find him. The question now was whether he had the courage to help them, and whether he could open his heart enough to let them help him in return. Father Miguel Santos had been the priest at St. Catherine's in Millbrook for 15 years, long enough to know that Samuel Cross was not a man who sought spiritual guidance. So when the cattle baron appeared at the church door on a crisp October morning, clutching a worn letter and looking more unsettled than Father Miguel had ever seen him, the priest knew something extraordinary was happening. "I need your help," Samuel said without preamble. "I have a letter in Spanish, and I need to know what it says." Father Miguel, a gentleman in his 50s, whose own family had emigrated from Mexico, nodded and gestured Samuel into his modest office. "Of course, my son. Please, sit." Samuel remained standing, too agitated to settle. "There are 3 girls staying on my property, orphans from Santa Fe. They have this letter, and it's connected somehow to my sister Mary. She died 20 years ago, but these children, they have her things, her photograph, her music box." The priest's eyebrows rose with interest, but he simply extended his hand. "May I see the letter?" Samuel handed over the precious document, watching nervously as Father Miguel unfolded it with reverent care. The priest read silently for several minutes, his expression growing more grave with each line. Finally, he looked up at Samuel with eyes full of compassion. "This letter," Father Miguel said slowly, "was written by a woman named Isabella Morales. She was dying when she wrote it, and it was meant for you specifically." Samuel's throat tightened. "What does it say?" Father Miguel cleared his throat and began to translate, his voice soft but clear. "My dearest Samuel Cross, brother of my beloved Maria, if you are reading this, then my daughters have found you, and I am with God. I write this with hands that shake, knowing my time grows short, but I must tell you what Maria asked me to tell you before she died." Samuel sank into the chair he'd refused moments before. "Mary asked her to tell me something?" "Yes. Isabella writes that she was Maria's closest friend in Santa Fe. Your sister lived there for 18 years after she left Colorado. She married, had children, lived a full and happy life. But she never stopped hoping that someday you would forgive yourself for what happened." The words hit Samuel like physical blows. "Forgive myself?" Father Miguel continued reading. "Maria told me about the fire, about your father's death, about the angry words that drove you apart. She said you blamed yourself for not being there when she needed you most. But Samuel, she never blamed you. Never. She understood why you left, why you couldn't bear to stay in that house of sorrow. She told me many times that grief makes people do things they later regret, and love means forgiving them anyway." Samuel's vision blurred. For 20 years, he'd carried the weight of abandoning Mary in her darkest hour, of letting his anger and pride keep him from being the brother she deserved. To learn that she'd understood, that she'd forgiven him, even when he couldn't forgive himself, it was almost too much to bear. "There's more," Father Miguel said gently. "Isabella writes that Maria made her promise something before she died. If anything ever happened to Isabella, if her daughters were ever orphaned and in need, Isabella was to send them to you. Maria believed that caring for these children would give you the family you'd always been afraid to have and give them the protection they would need." "But why me?" Samuel whispered. "I failed Mary when she needed me most." "Because," Father Miguel read, "Maria knew that your failure came from love, not from cruelty. She said you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever known, but you were afraid to use it because losing people hurt too much. She wanted you to have another chance, no to make up for the past, but to build something new." Samuel sat in stunned silence as the full weight of the letter settled over him. Mary had not only forgiven him, she'd orchestrated this reunion from beyond the grave, trusting him with the most precious thing imaginable, 3 innocent lives. "The girls," he managed, "are they?" "Isabella's daughters, yes. Rosa is 10, Elena 8, Carmen 5. Isabella writes that she raised them with stories of Maria, taught them her songs, shared her memories. In their minds, you're not a stranger, you're Uncle Samuel, Maria's brother, the man their mother promised would keep them safe." Father Miguel folded the letter carefully. "Isabella died of consumption 3 weeks ago. She had no family left, no one to care for the girls. Her last act was to give them this letter, your sister's photograph, and enough money for the journey. She told them to be brave, to find the Cross Ranch in Colorado Territory, and to trust that Maria's brother would help them. They traveled alone. 3 children? According to the letter, they joined a wagon train heading north, but they had to leave it when the other families grew suspicious of children traveling without adults. They've been walking and accepting rides where they could find them. Isabella estimated it would take them 2 weeks to reach you." Samuel thought of Rosa's careful protectiveness, Elena's brave attempts at English, Carmen's resilient smile despite their circumstances. These children had crossed hundreds of miles of dangerous territory on nothing but faith in a dead woman's promise and a stranger's goodness. "There's one more thing," Father Miguel said. "Isabella mentions that she has some possessions of Maria's, that she's kept for the girls' things that belonged to your sister that she wanted them to have when they were older. She hid them with the priest at Santa Fe before she died." Samuel's hands trembled as he took the letter back. "Father, I don't know how to care for children. I've lived alone for 30 years. I don't know the first thing about being responsible for anyone else." Father Miguel smiled. "Perhaps that's exactly why Maria chose you. Samuel, in all my years as a priest, I've learned that the people who worry most about their ability to love are often the ones most capable of it. Those girls didn't find you by accident. They found you because a dying woman trusted you with her greatest treasure, and a dead woman believed in your capacity for redemption." The ride back to the ranch felt different than any Samuel had taken before. The familiar landscape looked the same, but he saw it through new eyes, the eyes of a man who was no longer alone, who had 3 young lives depending on his decisions. The responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. When he reached the barn, he found the girls exactly where he'd left them, but they'd been busy. Rosa had swept the area around their makeshift camp. Elena had arranged wildflowers in a rusty tin can, and Carmen had somehow convinced one of the barn cats to let her pet it. They looked up at his approach with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "I had the letter translated," Samuel said, settling down on a hay bale to face them. "I know about your mama, about Isabella. I know why you came here." Rosa's English had improved dramatically in just 2 days. "You know about promesa, promise?" "Yes, your mama promised that if anything happened to her, she would send you to me, and my sister Mariashe wanted me to take care of you." Rosa translated rapidly for her sisters, and Samuel watched their faces transform. Elena began to cry, not tears of sadness, but of relief. Carmen clapped her hands and said something that made Rosa laugh for the first time since he'd met her. "What did she say?" Samuel asked. She knew you would help. She say you have kind eyes, like Mama told us." Samuel felt his chest tighten with emotion he'd kept buried for decades. "Girls, I want you to understand something. I'm not used to having people depend on me. I'm not sure I'll be very good at taking care of you. But I want to try. If you're willing to be patient with me, I'd like you to stay here. Not just for a few days, for as long as you need a home." Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she translated for her sisters. The conversation that followed was rapid and emotional, punctuated by hugs and more tears. Finally, Rosa turned back to Samuel. "We stay," she said simply. "We help you learn. You help us learn. We be family." The word hit Samuel harder than he'd expected. Family. For 30 years, he'd convinced himself he didn't need one, didn't want the complications and responsibilities that came with caring about others. But looking at 3 little girls who had traveled across a territory to find him, who trusted him with their lives based on nothing but a dying woman's faith in his goodness, Samuel realized he'd been wrong about a lot of things. That afternoon, he took them into town for the first time. Millbrook wasn't larger main street with essential businesses, a church, a school, and perhaps 300 residents, but it was the girls' first real introduction to their new world. They stayed close to Samuel's side, wide-eyed and curious but still cautious around strangers. Their first stop was Henderson's General Store, where Martha Henderson had been dispensing supplies and gossip in equal measure for 20 years. She took one look at the 3 girls and raised an eyebrow at Samuel. "Well, Samuel Cross, this is a surprise. And who might these young ladies be?" "Rosa, Eleanor, and Carmen," Samuel said, feeling strangely proud as he introduced them. "They'll be staying with me for a while. They need some proper clothes, shoes, whatever children require." Martha's eyes softened as she took in the girls' mended dresses and makeshift shoes. "Of course, dear. Girls, come with me. Let's see what we can find." What followed was Samuel's first lesson in the complexity of caring for children. There were sizes to consider, preferences to navigate, and a bewildering array of items he'd never imagined children needed. Undergarments, nightgowns, sturdy shoes, warm coats, hair ribbons, and countless other necessities that made his head spin. Rosa proved to be a thoughtful shopper, choosing practical items in colors that would hide dirt. Elena was drawn to anything beautiful, running her fingers over lace trim and bright fabrics with an artist's appreciation. Carmen wanted everything purple and spent 10 minutes debating between 2 hair ribbons that looked identical to Samuel. By the time they finished, Samuel had spent more money on clothing than he typically spent in 6 months. But the transformation in the girls was worth every penny. They stood straighter, smiled more freely, and Carmen actually skipped as they walked back to the wagon. Their final stop was the schoolhouse, where Miss Sarah Whitman had been teaching Millbrook's children for the past 8 years. Samuel had never had occasion to speak with her before, but he knew her by reputation as a patient, dedicated teacher who had worked miracles with even the most challenging students. "Mr. Cross," she said, clearly surprised to see him. "How can I help you?" "These girls will need to attend school," Samuel said. "Their English is limited, but they're bright. Rosa can read and write in Spanish, and Elena shows artistic ability. I was hoping you might have room for them." Miss Whitman knelt to the girls' level and spoke to them gently, asking simple questions in both English and Spanish. Within minutes, she had Carmen giggling and Elena showing off her wildflower drawings from the barn. "They'll do fine," she assured Samuel. "Children are remarkably adaptable, and these three have obviously had good guidance. Rosa can help translate for her sisters while they adjust, and I have some Spanish primers that will help bridge the language gap." As they drove home in the gathering twilight, Samuel found himself listening to the girls' chatter with a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. They switched between English and Spanish, pointed out landmarks they were learning to recognize, and made plans for their first day of school. When they reached the ranch, Samuel made another decision that surprised him. "Tonight, you'll sleep in the house," he announced. "I have spare rooms that need to be used." The excitement in their voices as they explored their new living quarters was infectious. Samuel found himself smiling as Carmen discovered a rocking chair. Elena admired the view from an upstairs window, and Rosa ran her hand along the polished banister with reverence. As he tucked them into beds that had been empty for decades, Samuel Cross realized that his sister had given him the greatest gift imaginable. No, just 3 children to care for. But the chance to discover that his heart was much larger than he'd ever dared to believe. The house no longer felt empty, and for the first time in 30 years, neither did he. 3 weeks into their new life together, Samuel was beginning to understand that caring for children was far more complex than managing cattle or calculating profit margins. Children had emotions that couldn't be organized into neat columns, needs that didn't follow predictable schedules, and a way of worming into your heart when you least expected it. Rosa had adapted to school with impressive determination, throwing herself into English lessons with the focus of someone who understood that language was the key to belonging. Elena had made friends with 2 girls her age and had begun drawing pictures of their new life, the ranch house, the barn, even Samuel himself, always depicted with a stern expression that made him wonder if that's truly how she saw him. Carmen had charmed everyone she met, including Dutch Williams, who had started carving small wooden animals for her during his lunch breaks. But it was on a quiet Sunday evening, as Samuel sat reading in his study while the girls played in the front room, that Rosa approached him with something that would change everything once again. "Tío Samuel," she said, using the Spanish term for uncle that had gradually replaced the more formal Mr. Cross. "We have something more for you, from Mama." She held out a small velvet pouch, worn soft with age and handling. Samuel set aside his book and accepted it with curiosity. Inside, nestled in faded silk, was a Ringer simple gold band, set with a small sapphire that caught the lamplight like trapped starshine. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He knew this ring. He'd seen it on Mary's finger the last time they'd spoken, during that terrible argument 20 years ago, when grief and anger had made them both say things that couldn't be taken back. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. Rosa settled into the chair beside his desk, her young face serious. "Mama Isabella keep it. She say Maria give it to her before she die. Tell her to save it for us. But Maria say, if we ever find you, we give it back." Samuel's hands trembled as he held the ring up to the light. It had been their mother's wedding ring, passed down through 3 generations of Cross women. When their parents died in the cholera outbreak, Mary had been the one to inherit it, the one destined to carry on the family traditions. "Maria say something else," Rosa continued, her English more confident now but still careful. "Mama Isabella write it down, so I remember the words exact." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper, covered in her own careful handwriting. "Maria say, tell my brother that love is not something you save for when you feel worthy of it. Love is what makes you worthy of everything else." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. For 20 years, he'd told himself he wasn't worthy of family, wasn't worthy of love, wasn't worthy of the connections that gave life meaning. He'd built his empire in isolation, convinced that success measured in cattle and acreage could substitute for the relationships he'd destroyed through his own pride and fear. But Mary had known better. Even dying in a distant city, surrounded by the life she'd built without him, she'd understood that his self-imposed exile was just another form of fear. She'd kept his ring, kept his place in her heart, and arranged for these three precious children to find him when he was finally ready to learn the lesson she'd tried to teach him years ago. "There's more," Rosa said gently, as if she could sense the emotion overwhelming him. "Mama Isabella keep other things too. She say when we find you, when we know you keep us safe, then we tell you about them." "What other things?" Rosa bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. "Letters. Many letters. Maria write them but never send. She write to you for many years. Every month. Sometimes more. She tell you about her life, her husband, her children, her garden. She tell you she miss you, she forgive you, she hope someday you come to see her." The revelation staggered Samuel. While he'd been nursing his guilt and pride, refusing to answer her letters, Mary had continued writing to him anyway. She'd poured her life onto paper, sharing her joys and sorrows with a brother who had cut himself off from her love. "Her children," Samuel said hoarsely. "Mary had children?" "See, 2 sons, 1 daughter. But they are grown now, have families of their own. Mama Isabella say they live in California, in Mexico. They not know about us, about you. But Maria, she always hoped they meet their Uncle Samuel someday." Samuel closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd lost through his own stubbornness. Nephews and a niece he'd never met, family gatherings he'd missed, celebrations and sorrows he'd refused to share. Mary had built a beautiful life, and he'd chosen to remain ignorant of it rather than risk being hurt again. "The letters," he said. "Where are they now?" "Safe place. Mama Isabella give them to Father Rodriguez in Santa Fe. She say, if we find you, if you want them, we can write to him." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice. The thought of reading Mary's words, of glimpsing the life she'd lived in his absence, was both desperately appealing and terrifying. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Samuel sat at his kitchen table and truly looked at his life for the first time in decades. The house around him was well built and comfortable, filled with expensive furniture and modern conveniences. His bank accounts were substantial, his property vast, his reputation solid. By every measure society used to judge success, he was a wealthy and accomplished man. But until 3 weeks ago, he'd been eating dinner alone every night, at a table that could seat 12. He'd been sleeping in a house with 6 bedrooms, 5 of them empty. He'd been managing an empire with no one to inherit it, building a legacy with no one to share it. The girls had changed all that. Suddenly, his house was filled with voices, laughter, the sounds of life being lived. Carmen's giggles echoed from the front parlor, where she played with her wooden animals. Elena's drawings adorned the kitchen walls, bringing color to spaces that had been purely functional. Rosa's careful questions about ranch operations showed an interest in understanding the business that would someday be part of their security. For the first time in 30 years, Samuel was part of something larger than himself. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Children required constant attention in ways that cattle never did. They had opinions about food, preferences about clothing, and emotional needs that couldn't be addressed with money or authority. Samuel found himself consulting Martha Henderson about everything from proper nutrition to age-appropriate bedtimes, asking Miss Whitman about educational progress, and even seeking Father Miguel's advice about handling nightmares and homesickness. But the rewards far outweighed the difficulties. Watching Rosa master a difficult English passage, seeing Elena's face light up when she successfully helped with the morning milking, feeling Carmen's small hand slip into his as they walked to the barns, moments filled spaces in Samuel's heart he hadn't even realized were empty. The community of Millbrook had embraced the girls with characteristic frontier, pragmatism, and kindness. Martha Henderson had appointed herself their honorary grandmother, teaching them to knit and sharing stories of her own children who had grown and moved away. Dr. Thompson had examined them thoroughly and pronounced them healthy, despite their difficult journey. Even stern Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, had softened when Carmen had presented her with a bouquet of wildflowers, picked especially for her. But it was Miss Whitman who provided Samuel with the insight that helped him understand what was really happening in his transformed household. "Mr. Cross," she said after keeping Rosa and Elena after school one day to work on a special project, "I hope you realize what remarkable children these are. Not just because they're bright or well-behaved, but because of how they've learned to care for each other. Rosa translates not just words, but emotions for her sisters. Elena uses her art to help Carmen express feelings she doesn't have words for yet. Carmen's joy lifts their spirits when they're sad or frightened." Samuel nodded, having observed these same dynamics himself. "But what's most remarkable," Miss Whitman continued, "is how they're teaching you the same lessons. They're showing you that taking care of someone doesn't diminish you, it multiplies you. Every act of love you give them comes back to you threefold." That evening, as Samuel helped Rosa with her arithmetic homework while Elena read to Carmen from a picture book, he understood what Miss Whitman meant. For 30 years, he'd approached life like a business transaction, taking calculated risks, protecting his resources, avoiding investments that might not pay off. But love didn't work that way. Love was the one thing that grew when you gave it away, the one investment that guaranteed returns beyond anything he could have imagined. As he tucked the girls into their beds that night, Samuel Cross realized he was no longer the same man who had found 3 ragged children in his barn a month ago. That man had been wealthy but empty, successful but alone, protected but unloved. This man, this uncle, this guardian, this suddenly expanded heart, learning to embrace the beautiful chaos of family, this man was truly rich for the first time in his life. The leather-bound Bible had been gathering dust on Samuel's shelf for the better part of 2 decades, a relic from his childhood when faith had seemed as natural as breathing. But on this particular Sunday evening in November, with winter's first snow beginning to dust the mountains and 3 little girls gathered around the fireplace, Samuel found himself reaching for the familiar weight of Scripture. "What's that book, T.O. Samuel?" Carmen asked, her English improving daily, though she still preferred the Spanish endearment for uncle. "This is a Bible," Samuel said, settling into his chair, with the girls arranging themselves on the rug at his feet. "It has stories about faith, about families, about people learning to trust in something bigger than themselves." Rosa looked up with interest. "Mama Isabella read to us from the Bible. She say the stories help us understand God's love." Elena nodded eagerly. "I like the story about the man who built the big boat for all the animals." "Noah," Samuel said, surprised at how easily the name came back to him. "Would you like me to read to you?" The enthusiasm in their faces answered his question. As Samuel opened the Bible and began to read the familiar story of Noah's Ark, he found himself seeing it through new eyes. Here was a man asked to care for creatures that weren't his own, to provide shelter and safety for the vulnerable, to have faith that his efforts would lead to new beginnings. The parallels weren't lost on him. Over the following weeks, their evening Bible readings became a treasured tradition. Samuel rediscovered stories that had shaped his childhood understanding of right and wrong, of mercy and forgiveness, of the importance of caring for those who couldn't care for themselves. The girls brought their own perspectives, asking questions that made him think more deeply about faith than he had in years. "Why did the prodigal son's father forgive him so quickly?" Rosa asked one evening after they'd read that particular parable. Samuel considered the question carefully. "I think because the father understood that love doesn't keep score. When someone you care about comes home, you don't waste time being angry about where they've been. You just celebrate that they're back." "Like Maria forgave you?" Elena asked, with the directness that only children possessed. The question took Samuel's breath away. "Yes," he said finally, "like Maria forgave me." But even as their family bonds strengthened, Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Samuel first became aware of them through Dutch Williams, who mentioned that strangers had been asking questions in town. Two men, well-dressed city types, Dutch reported. They were asking about you, boss, specifically about whether you'd taken in any children recently. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. What kind of questions? Legal-type questions. About guardianship, about your marital status, about whether children living here would be properly supervised. Martha Henderson sent them packing with a few choice words about minding their own business, but they seemed real interested in your affairs. That evening, Samuel pulled Rosa aside for a serious conversation. Rosa, did your mama ever mention other family members? People who might have a claim to you and your sisters? Rosa's face clouded with worry. Why, you ask, Tio? Some men have been asking questions about you girls. I want to make sure I understand who might have legal rights regarding your care. Rosa bit her lip, thinking carefully. Mama Isabella have brother, Eduardo, but she no like him. She say he only care about money, not about people. She say. Rosa struggled for the right words. She say he try to take our papa's things after papa die. She make sure he no can touch them. Where does Eduardo live? Denver. He work for lawyers, help rich people with papers. Mama Isabella say he always want things that no belong to him. Samuel's stomach sank. If Isabella had a brother in Denver with connections to the legal system, it would explain the questions being asked in town. But what would motivate a man to track down 3 orphaned nieces he apparently hadn't cared enough to help when their mother was alive? The answer came a week later in the form of an official-looking letter delivered by a territorial marshal. Samuel read it twice before the full implications sank in. Eduardo Morales was petitioning for guardianship of his deceased sister's children, claiming that Samuel Cross was an unfit guardian due to his unmarried status and lack of experience with children. Furthermore, Morales argued that the children had been taken from Colorado territory without proper legal authorization and should be returned to family members who could provide appropriate supervision. The letter went on to detail Samuel's questionable background, his history of isolation, his lack of involvement in community affairs, his business practices that prioritized profit over human relationships. Someone had done considerable research into Samuel's life and had painted him in the worst possible light. But it was the final paragraph that revealed the true motivation behind the guardianship petition. Isabella Morales had apparently inherited a modest estate from her deceased husband, including property in Santa Fe and a small trust fund meant to provide for her daughter's education and dowries. Eduardo Morales, as the children's guardian, would have control over these assets until the girls reached adulthood. Samuel crumpled the letter in his fist, rage building in his chest like a gathering storm. This wasn't about providing a better home for 3 orphaned children. This was about money, pure and simple. Eduardo Morales saw his nieces as a means to control their inheritance, nothing more. That evening, Samuel called the girls together for a family meeting. He explained the situation as gently as possible, watching their faces cycle through confusion, fear, and finally, a determination that reminded him powerfully of their mother's strength. "We no go with him," Rosa said firmly. "We choose you. We choose this home." "I know, sweetheart, but the law is complicated. Just because we want to stay together doesn't mean we'll be allowed to." Elena, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "Tio Samuel, you marry someone, then you have wife, and they no can say you unfit." Samuel blinked in surprise. "Elena, marriage isn't something you do just to solve legal problems. You marry someone because you love them, because you want to build a life together. But if you love someone, and she love you, and she love us too," Carmen added, her child's logic cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Samuel realized they were right, in their innocent way. His unmarried status was being used against him, portrayed as evidence that he couldn't provide a proper family environment. But more than that, he was beginning to understand that the walls he'd built around his heart hadn't just kept pain out, they'd kept love out too. "Girls," he said carefully, "are you suggesting I should find a wife?" The enthusiasm in their faces was unmistakable. Rosa began planning immediately, as was her nature. Mrs. Henderson know everyone. Miss Whitman is very pretty and very smart. Maybe you ask her to dinner. Rosa, Samuel laughed despite the gravity of their situation. It's not quite that simple. But as he tucked them into bed that night, Samuel found himself thinking about the conversation more seriously. He had perhaps 3 weeks before the custody hearing. 3 weeks to prove that he could provide a stable, loving home for these children. 3 weeks to convince a territorial judge that an unmarried cattle baron was a better choice than a legal-minded uncle with questionable motives, but blood ties and proper credentials. The next morning, Samuel made a decision that would have shocked his younger self. He dressed in his best suit, checked his appearance in the mirror, and rode into town with a purpose that had nothing to do with cattle or business, and everything to do with the family he was finally ready to fight for. Love, he was learning, sometimes required more courage than he'd ever imagined. But for 3 little girls who had crossed a territory to find him, who had brought his sister's forgiveness and his own redemption wrapped in small packages of trust and hope, Samuel Cross was prepared to risk everything, even his well-guarded heart. The music box sat open on Samuel's kitchen table, its delicate melody filling the morning air as Carmen hummed along. But it was Rosa's careful exploration of the box's interior that led to the discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their family connection. "T.O. Samuel," Rosa called, her voice tight with excitement. "There's something hidden here." Samuel looked up from his correspondence with the Santa Fe priest about Mary's letters. Over the past week, since learning about Eduardo Morales' custody petition, he'd been trying to gather every piece of documentation that might help his case. Rosa's discovery interrupted his urgent letter writing. "What do you mean, hidden?" Rosa turned the music box toward him, pointing to a tiny panel in the velvet lining that had come loose. "Look, the fabric is different here, like someone sewed it special." Samuel examined the box more closely. Rosa was right there, was a small section where the lining had been carefully stitched to create a hidden compartment. With gentle fingers, Rosa worked the stitches loose and reached inside. What she withdrew made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. It was another letter, this one sealed with wax and bearing his name in Mary's familiar handwriting. But unlike the letters Father Rodriguez was keeping in Santa Fe, this one had clearly been meant for a specific moment, a specific revelation, to be opened only when Samuel has found his family. Rosa read from the envelope's front, her English careful but clear. Samuel's hands shook as he broke the seal. The letter inside was written in Mary's hand, but it was in English's, if she'd known that others would need to understand its contents. "My dearest brother Samuel," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then Isabella's daughters have found you, and you have opened your heart to them as I always knew you would. But there is something more you must know, something I could never tell you while I lived, because I feared you would reject it out of guilt and shame." Samuel's vision blurred as he continued reading, the words swimming before his eyes as their meaning became clear. "The girls you have welcomed into your home are not just Isabella's daughters. They are our family by blood. Isabella was my daughter-in-law, married to my eldest son Miguel before consumption took him 3 years ago. Rosa, Elena, and Carmen are not just children I asked you to care for, they are your great nieces, your own blood, the continuation of our family line that I thought had ended with my death." The letter fell from Samuel's numb fingers. Rosa picked it up and continued reading, her voice growing stronger as she understood the magnitude of what she was discovering. "I know you believe you failed me, Samuel, but you must understand the truth. After I left Colorado, I built a beautiful life in Santa Fe. I married a good man named Francisco Morales, and we had 3 children: Miguel, Isabella's husband, Carlos, who moved to California, and Elena, who married and moved to Mexico. I named my daughter Elena after our mother, just as you see our mother's spirit in the little Elena who now lives with you." Samuel sank into his chair, overwhelmed. The girls weren't just Mary's charity cases or the children of family friends. They were his family, his sister's granddaughters, carrying his blood, his heritage, his legacy. "But why?" he whispered. "Why didn't she tell me while she was alive?" Rosa continued reading, as if Mary had anticipated his exact question. "I never told you because I feared you would see them as an obligation rather than a gift. I feared you would take them out of duty rather than love. But Isabella and I planned this carefully, my dear brother. When consumption began to take me, I made Isabella promise that if anything happened to her, she would send the girls to you without revealing the blood connection. I wanted you to choose them, to love them, to welcome them into your heart before you knew they were already part of it." Elena and Carmen had gathered around the table, sensing the importance of the moment, even if they couldn't follow every word. Samuel reached out and pulled them close, seeing them with new eyes, not as charity cases he'd rescued, but as his own flesh and blood, the daughters he'd never had, the family he'd always been meant to protect. "There's more," Rosa said, her voice trembling with emotion as she continued reading. "Samuel, Eduardo Morales is not Isabella's brother. He is Francisco's brother, which makes him the girl's uncle only by marriage, not by blood. He has no legal claim to them stronger than yours. More importantly, he is the one who tried to cheat Miguel out of his inheritance when Francisco died. Isabella feared him, and rightly so. He sees the girls only as a path to their father's estate." The revelation hit Samuel like a physical blow. Eduardo wasn't Morales, wasn't even a blood relative, yet he was using legal technicalities to try to steal children who rightfully belonged with their only living blood, family Samuel himself. "But how can we prove this?" Samuel asked, his mind racing through the legal implications. Rosa smiled and reached into the hidden compartment again. "Abuela Maria, think of everything," she said, using the Spanish word for grandmother that came so naturally now. "Look." She withdrew a roll of official documents, yellowed with age but still clearly legible. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificati, complete family tree that proved beyond doubt that the girls were Mary's granddaughters and Samuel's great-nieces. There was Miguel's birth certificate, listing Mary and Francisco as his parents. Miguel's marriage certificate to Isabella. The girls' birth certificates, listing Miguel and Isabella as their parents. And finally, Miguel's death certificate, showing that he had died 3 years ago, making Isabella a widow with 3 young children. "Your sister, she very smart lady," Rosa said, unconsciously echoing Samuel's own thoughts. "She knows someday we might need to prove who we are, where we belong." Samuel spread the documents across the table, his hands still trembling with the magnitude of what he'd learned. These weren't just 3 orphan children he'd taken in out of charity. They were his family, his legacy, his sister's gift to him across 20 years of separation and regret. But more than that, they were proof that Mary had never stopped believing in him, never stopped hoping that someday he would find his way back to love, back to family, back to the man she'd always known he could be. "Girls," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "do you understand what this means?" Rosa nodded solemnly. "It means we really are family. Not just because you choose us, but because we always been family. Abuela Maria just want you to choose us first." Elena clapped her hands together. "It means Eduardo no can take us. We belong here." Carmen, who had been listening with the serious attention that only very young children could muster, summed it up with the clarity that often came from innocent wisdom. "It means we home." That afternoon, Samuel rode into town with a purpose and energy he hadn't felt in years. He had documents to file, legal claims to establish, and a case to build that would ensure Eduardo Morales could never threaten his family again. But more than that, he had a story to tell, a story of love transcending death, of family bonds that couldn't be broken by time or distance, of 3 little girls who had carried their grandmother's faith across hundreds of miles to find the uncle who had been waiting for them his entire life without knowing it. As he passed the schoolhouse where Elena and Carmen were finishing their lessons, as he waved to Martha Henderson, who was sweeping her shop's front steps, as he nodded to Father Miguel, who was tending his small garden behind the church, Samuel Cross realized that he was no longer just a wealthy cattle rancher living in isolation. He was the guardian of Mary's legacy, the protector of the next generation, the man his sister had always believed he could become. And for the first time in 30 years, he was exactly where he belonged. Samuel's father's will had been locked away in the ranch safe for 30 years, a document he'd read only once after the funeral and then tried to forget. But as he prepared for the custody hearing that would determine his family's future, Samuel found himself drawn back to those yellowed pages and the words that had shaped his inheritance. The will itself was straightforward enough. The ranch, the cattle, the accumulated wealth, all left to Samuel as the surviving son. But it was the personal letter attached to the legal document that made Samuel's throat tighten as he read it again by lamplight in his study. "My son," his father had written in the careful script of a man who believed words carried permanent weight. "I leave you everything not because you are perfect, but because I have seen your capacity for love. Even when you try to hide it from yourself, you have the heart of a protector, though grief has made you forget it. Someday, when the pain lessens, you will remember that strength without compassion is merely cruelty, and wealth without family is merely loneliness. I pray that when that day comes, you will have the courage to open your heart again." Samuel set the letter down with trembling hands. His father had seen it, even then the potential for love that Samuel had spent 3 decades trying to bury. Thomas Cross had left him everything because he believed his son would eventually find someone worthy of sharing it with. Now, on the eve of the most important legal battle of his life, Samuel finally understood what his father had meant. The territorial courthouse in Denver was an imposing brick building that seemed designed to intimidate those who entered seeking justice. Samuel arrived early on the morning of the hearing, accompanied by Rosa, Elena, and Carmen, who wore their finest dresses and serious expressions that made them look older than their years. Their legal representation came in the form of James Morrison, a respected attorney from Colorado Springs who had ridden hard to Denver after receiving Samuel's urgent telegram. Morrison was a man in his 60s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm competence that came from decades of fighting for families in crisis. "The documents your sister preserved will be crucial," Morrison explained as they waited in the courthouse lobby. "They establish beyond doubt that the girls are your blood relatives, which gives you a stronger legal claim than Eduardo Morales could ever have. But we must be prepared for him to attack your character, your lifestyle, your fitness as a guardian." Samuel nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "Let him try. These girls have thrived in my care, and everyone in Millbrook will testify to that." Indeed, the support from their small community had been overwhelming. Martha Henderson had closed her store to attend the hearing, bringing with her a petition signed by nearly every resident of Millbrook attesting to Samuel's character transformation and the girls' obvious happiness. Miss Whitman had prepared detailed reports on their educational progress. Father Miguel had written a letter praising Samuel's spiritual renewal and his dedication to the children's welfare. Even Dutch Williams had put on his one good suit and made the journey to Denver, prepared to testify about the changes he'd witnessed in his boss over the past 2 months. But it was when Eduardo Morales entered the courthouse that Samuel felt the first chill of real apprehension. Morales was a thin, sharp-faced man in his 40s, impeccably dressed and accompanied by 2 younger attorneys who carried themselves with the arrogant confidence of men who believed law was about manipulation rather than justice. When Morales looked at the girls, Samuel saw no warmth, no affection, no recognition of them as anything more than assets to be acquired. "Uncle Eduardo," Rosa said quietly, her English now fluent enough to carry the weight of disappointment. "Why you want to take us away from our home?" Morales barely glanced at her. "Niña, you are too young to understand what is best for you. I am your family. I will provide proper supervision, proper education, proper opportunities." "We have all that already," Elena said firmly, moving closer to Samuel's side. Morales's expression hardened. You have an unmarried man playing house with children who are not his responsibility. It is inappropriate and improper. Carmen, who had been listening with the grave attention she brought to all adult conversations, surprised everyone by speaking up in her clear, accented English. Tio Samuel is the best papa we could have. Why you want to make us sad? For just a moment, Morales's mask slipped, and Samuel saw something ugly underneath resentment, greed, and a cold calculation that made Samuel's protective instincts flare. The hearing began with Judge Harrison, a stern man in his 70s who had been presiding over territorial family matters for more than 20 years. He examined the documents Samuel's team presented, his bushy eyebrows rising as he studied the birth certificates and family records that proved the blood relationship. "Mr. Morales," the judge said, "these documents appear to establish that Mr. Cross is the children's great-uncle by blood, while you are related only by marriage. Can you explain why you believe your claim should supersede his?" Eduardo Morales rose smoothly, his prepared argument rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Your Honor, while Mr. Cross may share blood with these children, he has lived in complete isolation for 30 years. He has no experience with children, no wife to provide maternal guidance, no community connections that would ensure proper socialization. Furthermore, he acquired these children through irregular means. They simply appeared on his property without proper legal procedures." Morales gestured toward a stack of documents his attorneys had prepared. "We have evidence of Mr. Cross's reclusive lifestyle, his business practices that prioritize profit over human relationships, his complete lack of involvement in community or church affairs prior to the children's arrival. Can the court truly believe that such a man can provide the stable, nurturing environment these children deserve?" The attack was well crafted and delivered with conviction, but Samuel found himself surprisingly calm as he listened. Everything Morales said about his past was true. Samuel had been isolated, had prioritized business over relationships, had lived like a hermit for 3 decades. But that man was gone, transformed by 3 little girls who had taught him that love multiplied when shared rather than diminished. When Morrison rose to present Samuel's case, he began not with legal arguments but with simple truth. "Your Honor, Mr. Morales is correct about who Samuel Cross was 6 months ago, but this court must consider who he is today, and more importantly, who these children have helped him become." Morrison called Martha Henderson to the stand first, and her testimony painted a picture of Samuel's transformation that was both dramatic and convincing. She spoke of his daily visits to town with the girls, his careful attention to their needs, his obvious pride in their accomplishments. Miss Whitman followed, providing detailed accounts of the girls' educational progress, their emotional stability, their clear attachment to Samuel, and confidence in his care. Father Miguel's testimony was perhaps the most powerful, as he spoke of Samuel's spiritual renewal, his active participation in the church community for the first time in decades, and the obvious love between him and the children. But it was Dutch Williams who provided the most compelling evidence of Samuel's character change. "Judge," Dutch said in his plain-spoken way, "I've worked for Samuel Cross for 15 years. In all that time, I maybe saw him smile twice. He was fair but cold, successful but lonely. Then these little girls showed up, and it was like watching a man wake up from a long sleep. He lights up when he talks about them, worries about them like any father would, takes pride in their smallest achievements. I've never seen anyone change so completely or so genuinely." When it came time for the girls to testify, Judge Harrison questioned them gently but thoroughly. Rosa spoke with the poise of someone far older than her 10 years, explaining their journey from Santa Fe, their mother's dying wish, and their happiness in their new home. Elena showed the judge some of her drawings pictures of the ranch, of Samuel teaching them to ride, of family dinners around the kitchen table. Carmen simply climbed into the witness chair and announced that Tio Samuel gives the best hugs and makes funny faces when he reads stories. But it was Eduardo Morales's cross-examination of Samuel that revealed the true nature of the man seeking custody. Mr. Cross, Morales said with practiced condescension, you admit that you had no relationship with my late sister-in-law, no knowledge of these children's existence before they appeared on your property. That's correct. And you admit that for 30 years, you lived in complete isolation, avoiding all family connections and community involvement. Yes. So essentially, you're asking this court to believe that 3 small children accomplished in 2 months what no other human being could achieve in 3 decades. They reformed your character completely. Samuel stood silent for a moment, considering his answer carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet conviction of a man who had finally learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation and independence. Mr. Morales, you're asking the wrong question. Those children didn't reform my character, they revealed it. My sister Mary saw something in me 30 years ago that I'd forgotten existed. She trusted these girls to find me not because she thought I was perfect, but because she knew I was capable of love when given the chance to prove it. The question isn't whether I've changed, it's whether you can honestly say you're seeking custody out of love for these children or for some other motive entirely. The challenge hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Eduardo Morales' careful composure cracked. His eyes flashed with anger, and when he spoke again, his true nature showed through. Love doesn't pay for education, Mr. Cross. Love doesn't provide security or opportunity. I can offer these children connections to proper society, enrollment in appropriate schools, introduction to families of standing. What can you offer them? A life on an isolated ranch with a man who has spent 30 years proving he wants nothing to do with human companionship. I can offer them a home, Samuel said simply, a place where they're valued for who they are, not what they might inherit. A family where love isn't conditional on performance or profit. The chance to grow up knowing they're wanted, not just needed. As the hearing concluded and Judge Harrison retired to consider his decision, Samuel gathered the girls close and realized that regardless of the outcome, these past 2 months had been the richest of his life. He'd found his family, discovered his purpose, and learned that the greatest inheritance he could leave wasn't land or cattle, but the knowledge that he had loved well and been loved in return. The waiting began, and with it, the final test of whether love truly was stronger than law, whether family bonds forged in the heart could overcome those written only on paper. The Millbrook Town Charter hung framed in Judge Harrison's chambers, a document Samuel had helped draft 15 years earlier when the growing community needed official territorial recognition. As they waited for the judge's decision, Samuel found himself staring at that charter and remembering the man he'd been then successful, respected, but utterly alone. The irony wasn't lost on him that a document bearing his signature might now help determine whether he could keep the family that had finally given his success, meaning. Judge Harrison returned to his chambers after an hour of deliberation, his expression unreadable as he settled behind his imposing desk. The girls sat close to Samuel, their small hands finding his as they waited for words that would determine their future. This case presents an unusual situation, the judge began, his voice carrying the weight of years spent making decisions that shaped families' lives. We have competing claims from 2 men who both assert they can provide appropriate care for 3 orphaned children. The law favors blood relationships, but it also requires the court to consider the best interests of the children involved. Eduardo Morales leaned forward slightly, confidence radiating from his posture. He'd built his case on legal technicalities and social conventions, painting Samuel as an unfit guardian, despite the obvious love between him and the girls. Mr. Morales, Judge Harrison continued, your petition raises valid concerns about propriety and social convention. An unmarried man raising 3 young girls does present certain challenges that a traditional family structure might better address. Samuel felt his chest tighten, but Rosa's small hand squeezed his with fierce determination. However, the judge said, and that single word changed everything, the evidence presented to this court tells a story that transcends conventional concerns. I have reviewed the documents establishing Mr. Cross as the children's great-uncle, making him their closest living blood relative. I have heard testimony from an entire community vouching for his character and the children's obvious well-being under his care. The judge picked up one of Elena's drawings, a picture of their family dinner table, with 4 stick figures smiling around plates of food. Most importantly, I have listened to 3 articulate, healthy, happy children who have clearly thrived under Mr. Cross's guardianship. Their educational progress, emotional stability, and obvious attachment to their guardian speak more loudly than any legal argument about propriety. Eduardo Morales's face darkened as he realized the direction of the judge's thoughts. Mr. Morales, while I appreciate your stated concern for your niece's welfare, I must note that your petition came only after learning of their inheritance. Your lack of involvement in their lives prior to their mother's death, combined with your apparent ignorance of their current well-being, raises questions about your true motivations. Samuel began to breathe easier, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. However, Mr. Cross, I cannot ignore the legitimate concerns raised about your unmarried status and the potential challenges that might present as these girls mature. While I am prepared to grant you permanent guardianship based on the evidence presented, I will be imposing certain conditions to ensure their continued welfare. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for the judge's specific requirements. First, the children will remain enrolled in Millbrook school system under Miss Whitman's supervision, with regular reports on their progress submitted to this court. Second, Mr. Cross will establish formal trust funds for each child's education and future security managed by an independent trustee. Third, the court will conduct annual reviews of the living situation to ensure continued appropriateness. Samuel nodded eagerly. These were reasonable requirements, safeguards he would have implemented himself. Most importantly, Judge Harrison continued, Mr. Cross, I strongly encourage you to consider the community support you've received during this process. The testimony of your neighbors, your priest, your employees, these people have vouched for you because they've seen the positive changes in your life. Continue to nurture those relationships. These children need more than just your love. They need the stability that comes from being part of a larger community. The judge's gavel came down with finality. Guardianship is granted to Samuel Cross, with the conditions stated. Mr. Morales, your petition is denied. The explosion of relief in the courtroom was immediate. Rosa burst into tears of joy, Elena clapped her hands, and Carmen launched herself into Samuel's arms with a squeal of delight. Martha Henderson dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, while Dutch Williams allowed himself a rare smile. But Eduardo Morales wasn't finished. As the courtroom began to empty, he approached Samuel with barely contained fury. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You may have won today, but I know about the inheritance, about the property in Santa Fe. Those children are entitled to substantial assets, and I won't let some hermit rancher mismanage their legacy." Samuel stood slowly, his full height and years of ranch work evident in his frame. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had finally found something worth protecting. "Mr. Morales, those children's legacy isn't measured in property or bank accounts. Their legacy is the love their mother gave them, the courage their grandmother instilled in them, and the family they've built here in Millbrook. If you ever threaten that again, you'll discover that this hermit rancher has learned a few things about fighting for what matters." Morales retreated, but not before casting one last venomous look at the girls who had slipped forever beyond his grasp. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Samuel knelt down to the girls' level, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going home," he said simply. "All of us, together, for as long as you want me to be your family." Rosa threw her arms around his neck. "Forever, Tio Samuel. We choose forever." The ride back to Millbrook felt different than any journey Samuel had ever taken. He wasn't returning alone to an empty house and solitary meals. He was bringing his family home to a community that had embraced them all, to a future that stretched ahead filled with laughter, challenges, love, and the beautiful chaos of lives lived together. As they crested the hill that overlooked their valley, Carmen pointed excitedly at the ranch house waiting below. "Look, our house is happy to see us." And somehow, in the way that children could see truth that adults missed, Samuel knew she was right. The house did look happy, windows gleaming in the afternoon sun, smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney Dutch had promised to tend, everything waiting for their return. They were home, not just to a place, but to each other, to the family they'd chosen and fought for and won the right to keep. The legal battle was over, but the real victory had been won months ago, in a barn during a storm, when 3 brave little girls had trusted a lonely man to love them, and he'd finally found the courage to try. The new family portrait arrived from Denver 3 weeks after the custody hearing, delivered by the same photographer who had captured Millbrook's growing families for the past decade. Samuel held the framed image with trembling hands, hardly recognizing the man staring back at him. In the photograph, he sat in his best suit with Rosa standing at his right shoulder, her hand resting protectively on Elena's arm as the middle girl leaned against Samuel's chair. Carmen perched on his lap, her bright smile infectious even in the formal portrait. But it was Samuel's own expression that struck him most. Gone was the stern, isolated man who had spent 30 years hiding from human connection. In his place sat a father, surrounded by his daughters, his face soft with contentment and unmistakable love. "Do we look like a real family, Tio Samuel?" Carmen asked, studying the portrait with the serious attention she brought to all important matters. "We look like exactly who we are," Samuel replied, hanging the portrait in the place of honor above the fireplace. "We look like home." The celebration that followed their legal victory had been Millbrook's idea, not Samuel's. Martha Henderson had organized a community dinner at the church, ostensibly to welcome the girls officially, but really to celebrate Samuel's transformation from the town's most mysterious resident to one of its most beloved citizens. The evening had been a revelation for Samuel, who discovered that his neighbors saw him not as the cold, calculating businessman he'd believed himself to be, but as a man who had simply been waiting for the right reason to show his true nature. "You know," Dr. Thompson had said during the festivities, "I always wondered what would happen when you finally found something worth caring about more than your cattle. And now we know," Father Miguel had added with a smile, "you become the man God always intended you to be." But it was Miss Whitman who had provided the most profound insight as the evening wound down and Samuel helped clean up while the girls played with other children in the churchyard. "Mr. Cross," she'd said, "I hope you realize what you've accomplished here. Not just in providing those children with a home, but in showing this entire community what it means to choose love over fear, connection over isolation." Samuel had watched through the window as Rosa helped Carmen navigate a complicated game with the other children, as Elena shared her colored pencils with a shy boy who rarely spoke to anyone. "I think they're the ones who did the teaching, Miss Whitman. I was just lucky enough to be a willing student." Now, a month later, as winter settled over the Colorado Territory and their first Christmas together approached, Samuel found himself marveling at how completely his life had been transformed. The ranch still operated successfully, the cattle still needed tending, the business still required his attention. But everything was different because he was no longer doing it alone. Rosa had taken to the ranch operations with the same determination she brought to her English lessons, asking thoughtful questions about breeding programs and market strategies that showed she was already thinking about the future. Elena had discovered a talent for animal care, spending hours in the barn sketching the horses and cattle with an artist's eye for detail. Carmen had appointed herself chief morale officer, greeting every ranch hand with enthusiasm and somehow knowing exactly when someone needed one of her transformative hugs. The evening routine they'd established felt as natural as breathing now. Dinner around the kitchen table, with conversations that flowed between English and Spanish as the girls shared their daily adventures. Homework by lamplight, with Samuel discovering that helping with arithmetic and spelling could be as satisfying as closing a profitable business deal. Bible reading by the fireplace, with stories that had taken on new meaning when seen through the eyes of children who had experienced their own exodus, their own journey to a promised land. But it was bedtime that had become Samuel's favorite part of each day. The ritual of tucking each girl into bed, listening to their prayers in both languages, answering their questions about everything from why stars twinkled to whether he thought their Mama Isabella could see them from heaven. "Tio Samuel," Rosa had asked just the night before, "are you happy we found you?" The question had caught him off guard with its directness and its implications. These children still carried some uncertainty about their place in his life, still needed reassurance that they were wanted rather than merely tolerated. "Rosa," he'd said, sitting on the edge of her bed, "before you came here, I thought I was living my life, but I was really just existing, going through motions without meaning. You three didn't just find me, you saved me. You taught me that the bravest thing a person can do is love someone else completely, even when it means risking getting hurt. But we would never hurt you, Tio." Elena had chimed in from her bed across the room. "I know that now," Samuel had replied, "but for 30 years I was afraid to find out. Your grandmother Maria knew that fear was keeping me from the life I was meant to live, so she sent you to teach me that love makes us stronger, not weaker." Carmen had stirred from her nearly asleep state to add her own wisdom. "Love makes everything better. Even when things are hard, love makes them not so scary." As Samuel prepared for another Christmas morning, his first Christmas in decades that wouldn't be spent alone, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a wealthy but empty man, successful by every measure society used, but impoverished in all the ways that truly mattered. The transformation hadn't been easy, learning to put others' needs before his own, discovering that vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness, accepting that his carefully ordered world was more beautiful when it included the beautiful chaos of family life. These lessons had challenged everything he'd believed about himself and the world. But the rewards had exceeded anything he could have imagined. He'd gained not just 3 daughters, but an entire community that had embraced him once he'd shown them his true heart. He'd discovered that business success was more satisfying when it served a purpose beyond accumulation. He'd learned that the legacy he left behind would be measured not in land or cattle, but in the lives he'd helped shape and the love he'd given and received. As he looked around his transformed house, children's drawings decorating the walls, toys scattered in corners, books in both English and Spanish filling shelves that had once held only business journals, Samuel Cross realized he'd finally become the man his father had believed he could be, the brother his sister had always known he was, and the guardian these 3 precious children had needed him to become. The man who had once eaten Christmas dinner alone at a table set for one was gone forever. In his place sat a father, surrounded by his daughters, blessed beyond measure and grateful beyond words for 3 little girls who had refused to give up on finding him, even when he'd given up on finding himself. 6 months had passed since the custody hearing, and spring had returned to the Colorado Territory with the promise of new beginnings. In the small garden behind the ranch house, 3 wooden crosses stood among the wildflowers and herbs that Elena had planted with careful attention to color and meaning. The crosses bore no names, only simple Spanish words that the girls had chosen: Mama, Papa, and Abuela Maria. Samuel knelt beside the memorial garden each morning now, not out of obligation but out of genuine gratitude for the people whose love had guided 3 brave children across hundreds of miles to find him. The garden had been Rosa's idea, a way to honor their lost family while celebrating the new life they'd built together. "They would be so proud," he said quietly as Carmen joined him among the flowers, her small hands already dirty from helping with the morning weeding. "I think they are proud," Carmen replied with the certainty that only children possessed about matters of the heart. "When the wind makes the flowers dance, that's them saying hello." The transformation of the Cross Ranch had become something of a local legend in Millbrook. What had once been the domain of a solitary man had evolved into the heart of a bustling family operation. Rosa, now 11 and fluent in English, had begun keeping detailed records of the ranch's breeding programs and had ideas about expanding into sheep that impressed even Dutch Williams. Elena, 9 and blossoming into a gifted artist, had started a small business, selling her drawings of local landscapes to travelers passing through town. Carmen, 6 and full of unstoppable energy, had appointed herself official greeter for all ranch visitors, and somehow managed to know the names of every cow, horse, and chicken on the property. But it was the changes in Samuel himself that truly marked how far they'd all traveled from that stormy night when he'd found 3 frightened children in his barn. The man who had once spoken only when necessary now filled the house with conversation, laughter, and the occasional off-key singing that made the girls giggle. The rancher who had once eaten every meal alone now cooked elaborate Sunday dinners for whoever might stop. By Father Miguel, Miss Whitman, Martha Henderson, any of the ranch hands who had become extended family. The evening ritual of Bible reading had evolved into something richer and more meaningful than Samuel had ever experienced during his austere childhood. The girls brought their own questions and interpretations to the familiar stories, helping him see themes of redemption, forgiveness, and second chances that spoke directly to their own journey. Tio Samuel, Elena had asked just last week as they read about the prodigal son, "Do you think God planned for us to find you, or did we just get lucky?" Samuel had considered the questions seriously, as he'd learned to do with all their inquiries. "I think God gives us choices, Elena. Your mama chose to trust your grandmother's plan. Your grandmother chose to believe I could learn to love again. You 3 chose to be brave enough to find me. And I chose to open my heart when I could have kept it closed. So we all chose each other," Rosa had concluded with satisfaction. "Yes," Samuel had replied. "We all chose each other." The official adoption papers had been finalized in February, a legal formality that changed nothing about their day-to-day life, but everything about their security and sense of belonging. Judge Harrison had presided over the brief ceremony, noting with approval how the girls had flourished under Samuel's guardianship. Even Eduardo Morales' threat of appeal had come to nothing when his own questionable business practices had come under scrutiny by territorial authorities. Now, as Samuel sat in his study on this particular spring evening, he was engaged in a project that would have been unthinkable a year ago, writing his own letters to Mary's surviving children in California and Mexico. The correspondence had begun when Father Rodriguez in Santa Fe had forwarded contact information for Samuel's nephew and nieces, along with the carefully preserved letters Mary had written to Samuel over 20 years. Reading those letters had been both heartbreaking and healing, page after page of his sister's life, her marriage, her children's births and achievements, her garden, her involvement in the Santa Fe community, all shared with the brother she'd never stopped loving despite his refusal to respond. In every letter, Mary had expressed hope that someday Samuel would visit, would meet his nephew and nieces, would understand that forgiveness was always possible when love remained. Now Samuel was planning exactly such a visit. Rosa, Elena, and Carmen would meet their extended family for the first time, and Samuel would finally embrace the relatives he'd been too proud and fearful to know. The journey to California was planned for late summer, when the ranch work was lighter and the girls could take an extended break from school. "Are you nervous about meeting our cousins?" Rosa asked, appearing in the study doorway with the quiet grace that reminded Samuel so much of Mary. "A little," Samuel admitted. "It's been a long time since I had to explain who I am to family members." Rosa settled into the chair across from his desk, her expression thoughtful. "You are Tio Samuel, who found his heart when 3 little girls needed him to. You are the man who chose love over loneliness, family over fear. You are the brother their Tia Maria never stopped believing in." The simple wisdom of her words struck Samuel with their truth. He was no longer the man who had driven his sister away with angry words and stubborn pride. He was the man those 3 children had helped him become someone worthy of the love that had been waiting for him all along. As bedtime approached and Samuel prepared for the evening routine he'd come to treasure, he found himself reflecting on the miracle of transformation. A year ago, his house had been silent, except for the ticking of his father's pocket watch and the occasional creak of settling wood. Now it was filled with voices practicing English pronunciation, Spanish lullabies hummed while doing chores, and the constant background music of lives being lived together. The dining room table that had sat empty for 30 years now hosted not only family meals but homework sessions, art projects, and the weekly meetings of the Millbrook Ladies Charitable Society that Martha Henderson had convinced Samuel to host. The parlor that had been a museum of unused furniture now echoed with piano lessons as Elena learned to play the melodies her grandmother had taught her mother. Most importantly, the master bedroom was no longer the only occupied space in a house built for a large family. Down the hall, 3 girls slept soundly in rooms they had decorated with their own artwork, their few treasured possessions from Santa Fe, and the growing collection of books, toys, and mementos that marked their journey from orphaned refugees to beloved daughters. As Samuel completed his evening round-checking doors, banking the fire, reviewing the next day's schedule, he paused at each girl's doorway. Rosa slept with a book still open beside her pillow, ever the serious student. Elena had fallen asleep, surrounded by her latest drawings, planning tomorrow's artistic adventures. Carmen clutched the wooden horse Dutch had carved for her face peaceful with the absolute security that came from knowing she was loved and protected. In his own room, Samuel opened the drawer where he kept his most precious possessions. Mary's ring, the girls' original photograph of their grandmother, the letter that had revealed the family connection he'd been too blessed to recognize. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the trust 3 brave children had placed in him. But tonight, Samuel Cross went to sleep, as he had every night for the past year, grateful beyond measure, for the miracle of second chances, for the power of love to transform even the most guarded heart, and for 3 little girls who had traveled across a territory to teach a lonely man that the greatest treasures in life often came disguised as the responsibilities we thought we couldn't handle. The house settled into peaceful silence, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the contented quiet of a family at rest, of dreams being dreamed together, of love that had found its way home at last. And in the garden outside, the spring wind stirred the flowers planted in memory of those who had made this miracle possible, carrying their blessing across the ranch where love had finally learned to bloom again.